All right, so welcome to the last session of the day, of the second day of the conference. So my name's Eric Jacobson, and I love graphic novels. I've always been a comic book reader and made a transition into graphic novels. My own kids learned to read in part by reading graphic novels, and I definitely use them in my classroom. So my goal here today is to not convert you. I'm not gonna make a hard sell, but I am gonna hopefully give you some ideas to think about whether graphic novels might work with your students, and maybe for yourself. So just in the chat, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being I've never even picked up a graphic novel in the bookstore, to 10, Irene already put 1. I didn't even put the rest of the scale. So, and 10 being, why, thank you. I've actually written and published my own graphic novel. On a scale of 1 to 10, where are you on that scale? All right, so some 1s and 2s. All right, it's going up. Oh, Karen's got a 7. Yes, Karen's a fan of this modality. So, all right, well, oh, Brian's got a 9. All right, so Brian's got a publication waiting to come out from graphic novel. Oh, Dave, you're a 6. All right, cool. All right, so I'm gonna basically what I'd like to do is walk through some basic ideas of graphic novels, sort of basic examples of it, give some ideas for the ways that it can be used in the classroom, and then open up the conversation to both graphic novels that you might recommend, right? Either because you read them or your students read them, or as somebody noted, your grandson maybe read them and you can recommend them that way. So, and then as with all the other sessions, I'll send you the PowerPoint afterwards. So that'll have some of the graphic novels on it that you can take a look at. So give me a second to share my screen. All right, let me open up the chat and the participants so I can see all this at the same time. Okay, so yeah, here's my email and here's how you would get in touch with me. All right, so let's start at the basics, right? So what's a graphic novel? So it is a long form piece of sequential art, right? So why sequential art? That seems kind of like a fancy schmancy way of talking about comic books, right? Or comic strips. The reason that people use the term sequential art, right, is that it's telling a story, right? So it's not just a single image. It's a series of images coming together to tell a story. It's generally, and can be fiction or nonfiction, it's generally complete in one volume, right? So compare it to like a comic book, where a comic book could go on for years and years and years, right? So a graphic novel is really designed to stand on its own, as if it's as any novel would, right? It may be part of a series, like there's other novels that have series, but it can stand on its own. Now, this is not going to matter so much for you. This is going to sound like inside baseball, but this is a picky point for some people, that graphic novel tends to be reserved for things that are published for the first time in that format, rather than collections of old comics that have been brought together and republished. That's technically a trade paperback, like it's a republication of it. I only let you know that because should you end up reading something that's a trade paperback and you talk about it as a graphic novel, there's some chance that somebody at the party is going to give you a hard time and be like, "Wow, that's really a trade paperback." And you can be like, "Yeah, whatever." All right. So just so you know, there's people that are like really persnickety about that. All right. The other important thing to know about graphic novels is that it's not a genre, right? Some people often refer to it as a genre. They're like, "Oh, I like mysteries, I like romance, I like graphic novels." It's not a genre because within graphic novels, all genres are represented, right? So you can have a graphic novel that's biography or autobiography. right? You can have a graphic novel that's history or current events. One of the oddest graphic novels I've ever heard of was there's a graphic novel version of the 9/11 report. Don't know that I would ever read that, but it exists, right? And so somebody took the 9/11 report and turned it into a graphic novel. There's graphic novels about science and about many different topics. And then, so as Karen thinks about it, it's really more of a format, right? It's a way of the print being produced and shared, right? And within fiction, there's also all the subgenres of fiction, right? So you've got drama, you've got suspense, you've got fantasy, you've got comedy, right? So sometimes people ask me, oh, you like graphic novels, like graphic novels. What would you recommend? And I'd be like, I don't know. What do you like, right? Do you like suspense? Do you like mystery? Do you like romance? Do you like history, right? Whatever genres you like, whatever, disciplines you like, then we can look for a graphic novel that goes with it, right? Does that make sense? Kind of right off the bat, like it's not a genre, it's a format. And within that format, there's lots and lots of different genres that people address, right? So possibly the most famous graphic novel of all time is Maus. I guess raise your electronic hand if you've heard of Maus. If you know where your electronic hands are, or.
Mickey Mouse.
All right, I see Brian's hand up. Renee, Suzanne. All right. If you can't find your electronic hand, turn your camera on and give me your analog hand and just kind of go that way. So we don't want to make technology a sticking point here, right? So Maus is potentially the most famous graphic novel. For those of you that have read it, for those of you that maybe heard of it, Art Spiegelman is the author, and it's an account of his own father surviving concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And the key to the story is that Spiegelman and his dad had sort of been like alienated from each other. And so by talking to his father about his experiences during the Holocaust, Spiegelman gets a better perspective on why his dad is the way that he is, right? So it's a memoir, and it's also sort of Spiegelman working through some of his own feelings of guilt towards his father and the fact that he was alienated from them. So famously, it's anthropomorphic. So in the novel, Jews are represented by mice, Nazis are represented by cats, the French are represented by frogs, the Swedes are represented by deer, the Americans are represented by dogs, and the Poles are represented by pigs. So at first, people are like, oh my gosh, like you're making a comic book, you're making a cartoon about the Holocaust, you're like belittling it, right? You're like, you're demeaning it. But it's a very serious study of the Holocaust. It's not a comic in the sense of ha ha. It's a comic in the format. It's a piece of sequential art. And Spiegelman chose each one of the anthropomorphic characters for a reason, right? So many folks in Poland are upset that the Poles are represented by pigs, for example, but Spiegelman has explained that, like pigs, they get fattened up by their owner until it's time to slaughter them, right? And so he's talked about sort of how the Nazis exploited the Poles until they turned on them. So it has won all sorts of awards. It's used all across the country in classrooms. Renee said it's a banned book in Florida. Probably there's many books getting banned in Florida, typically about either African-American history or the Holocaust, or non-US exceptionalism history, right? So in some ways, Maus kickstarted everybody's awareness of graphic novels. And in some ways, it's overshadowed other graphic novels that are out there. Like it's almost synonymous with graphic novels, which is not great, because it means people don't pay attention necessarily to other graphic novels that are out there. I recommend it as a read. I don't know, with any of these books, you would need to read them and think about your students' interest and your students' literacy skills, right? So Maus, because it has the memoir, it's got lots of backflashes in it, right? Flashbacks in it, right? So it goes back and forth in time. So if you have a student that would be sort of confused by the chronology, you would either have to pre-teach that or make that a point of the lesson, or maybe it wouldn't work for that student, right? But if they were ready to think about text structure, Maus would be a good example of how stories go back and forth in time, and you'd actually be able to see it, right? Because in one page, Spiegelman's father is old, and another page, Spiegelman's father is young because it's back during the Holocaust, right? So it would make visual going back and forth in time, which we don't always get as readers, right? When we're in a text, when we're reading a text. So people often think of Maus as the first graphic novel, right? But it's not. Lately, some people have argued for the work of Lind Ward, which goes all the way back to 1929. My suspicion is that 5 years from now, someone's going to say, actually, there was a graphic novel in 1915, and actually there was a graphic novel in 1891, right? Because what is it at its heart? It's a combination of images and text, right? And people have been combining images and text for as long as they've been making books, right? And as long as they've been putting stuff on walls. So I think we'll keep going back further and further, but clearly Lind Ward, you can see here, very stunning. It's a wordless picture. It's a wordless graphic novel, all based on woodblock prints, right? So each page is a single woodblock print. So you go page by page and go through the story, right? So just looking at these three images here, it's kind of the middle of this story. Somebody want to unmute and tell me, kind of walk me through the story that you see developing on these 3 pages and some of the language that you might use to describe what you're seeing? So rather than using the chat, I think it's easier if somebody just speaks. And if nobody else volunteers, I'm going to call you Dave. Okay.
He's alone in a boat during a storm, and he seems victorious. He's at the end, he's raising his hand and survived the storm. That's
okay. Good.
my interpretation of it.
Yep. All right, thanks, Lucy. So what words, what adjectives might you use for the first panel if you were going to describe it? Lucy or anybody, or you can put it in the chat, or you can.
Dangerous, daunting.
Okay, dangerous, daunting. That's good words.
Yes. Powerful.
Okay. Any other words that people would use for that first?
Terrifying, yes.
Swirling, right? The water swirling. Uncomfortable, yes, definitely uncomfortable. Rough waters, okay. All right, and then the second panel or the second page.
Big wave.
So there's a huge wave, right? Precipitous, cascading, terrifying, right? He's on the verge, right? He's on the verge of disaster, right? And then in the last panel, as Lucy said, there's some kind of breakthrough, right? So the sun is shining, right? And Ward was a religious person, right? So there's potentially a religious interpretation to this, right? But so you can see from the get-go, just using victorious, that's a good word too. So from the get-go, already in 1929 in Ward's work, we can see the story being told, right? In these pieces of art, the sequence of art, and you can see how the interpretation, you already can start to do interpretation even before you have text, right? And the language that you can use and the inferences that you can make, right? So in addition to Maus, which again takes up lots of oxygen, there's any number of other graphic novels out there. So these are just some. So the upper left-hand corner is Satchel Paige. Are any of you like baseball fans or old-time baseball fans or sports fans? So this story of Satchel Paige is a great story. He was an old pitcher in the Negro Leagues, and then he finally pitched in the major leagues. And there's a story where they were playing an all-white team, and they were shouting racist abuse at Satchel Paige when he was on the mound. So he told all the players on his team to come into the infield and sit down. And then he struck out the 3 batters. So he was like, I don't even need my players. I'm such a better pitcher than you are hitters, right? So it's a famous moment of baseball history. And so that Satchel Paige covers that story. The one in the middle, Ghetto Brother, is a story from the Bronx in the 70s when there was lots and lots of gang violence, and how some people broke away from gang violence to try to create a truce and create options for people in those neighborhoods, especially connected to the birth of hip hop, right? So I don't know how much you know, but like some of the early break dancers were actually like gang crews dancing off instead of fighting off, right? So this kind of deals with that. Evolution is this book literally about evolution. So it's a nonfiction book about evolution. The Most Costly Journey up here is stories of migrant farm workers in Vermont. So cartoonists in Vermont got the stories of migrant farm workers and turned them into stories and turned them into a graphic novel. It's a very nice piece of kind of community work, right? Syncopated is nonfiction. It's got stories about people baling hay, about people living in abandoned subway tunnels. AD, New Orleans After the Deluge, is a celebrated graphic novel. It's about Hurricane Katrina and people surviving Hurricane Katrina and what happened to them afterwards. So it's like a, street eye level of what was going on during Katrina. Private Eye, some graphic novels are science fiction. This is a science fiction story about somebody trying to reopen the internet. You can see here's a book called Relish. It's about eating. So it's got cartoons and recipes and eating, all right? And so if you like to cook, there's graphic novels for you, right? If you like comic books, right, to go back to comic books, or if you watch any of the Marvel movies, there was a comic book called The Vision, which sort of got turned into WandaVision, which was a TV show. This is an example of a trade paperback, but it's about a robot, the Vision, who tries to create a robot family in the suburbs and have a regular suburban life, and it doesn't go so well, right? Because it's a tragedy. In the lower left here, there's a graphic novel version of Game of Thrones, right? So sometimes there's graphic novel versions of novels that are out there. And here's a graphic novel version of Macbeth. So there's lots and lots of these types of things. I'm generally not super excited about them because, and most of the time I feel in these graphic novel adaptations of Shakespeare or Game of Thrones, the art's generally not very good. And it feels like they just took dialogue from the novel and put it on the page, right? And I'm like, if I was just going to read the dialogue, I would read the book, right? Like, what else are you giving me by the fact that it's a graphic novel? So not all graphic novels are equally ambitious when it comes to the art or the way to transfer the ideas. All right. So far, so good? Okay. So why should we think about using graphic novels in the classroom, right? So the first and the most basic reason one is that it matches student interests, right? So a lot of our students are interested in graphic novels, right? Or they're interested in the topics that graphic novels talk about. And so we should give them an opportunity to do that. I'm only talking about graphic novels here, but we have many younger students that are really interested in manga, which are Japanese comics. And the same thing would apply to them as well. Graphic novels connect with popular culture, right? They're up to date with what's happening in the world. Graphic novels also give us an exposure to diverse perspectives and cultures, right? So if we go back to this, here's the experience of farm workers. Here's the experience of somebody that was a gang member in the Bronx, right? Here's the experience of somebody that's like that's a chef. Here's the experience of people in Hurricane Katrina, right? So we can get lots and lots of perspectives and different people's cultures and experiences. Some people talk about graphic novels as a bridge to reading, but I would argue against that. It is reading, right? It's not training wheels, it's actually reading, right? And in some ways it requires particular skills because it's a different format, it's a different media. It requires some different skills, and we'll talk about those skills in a few minutes. Other reasons to use graphic novel, we know from research that more parts of the brain are fired up and working when you're working with both text and images than just working with text or images on their own, right? So from a neurological perspective, reading graphic novels are actually pretty nutritious, right? In terms of like brain function. The brain's doing a lot of interesting and important work. The other reason to use graphic novels is because you can really develop. So comics and graphic novels, Annette. So a comic might be something like, Peanuts in the newspaper, right? So a comic strip, that would still be sequential art, but that would be a comic strip. You have a comic book, which is typically 24, 26 pages and serialized. And a graphic novel is something that's a standalone collection that looks like this. It's thick, right? Or this size, right? So it's designed to be a novel. It's designed to be its own text, right? Is that helping it? Kind of thinking about what the difference is there. Okay, all the same things pertain when you're reading comics, right? You still need similar skills, but it's harder to bring comics into the classroom because you just have individual issues and not the whole story. So graphic novels are easier to use because you've got the whole story. All right, so some of the things that graphic novels help with are really key literacy skills. So visualization, right? So when we ask readers as part of comprehension to imagine what they're seeing, right? So reading comics, reading graphic novels actually help by connecting the text to an image, and it gives them practice visualizing. It also does help with sequencing, right? What comes first in the story? What comes next in the story? It helps with vocabulary. Most comics and graphic novels have more rare words than most other texts. So people often think, oh, graphic novels, it's kids stuff. It's going to be like, oh, biff, boom, bap. I hate you, bad guy. Right? Yeah. Georgina says sometimes you don't understand the joke. Like if you don't understand the cultural reference, then you're not going to understand the joke. Right? So it relies upon background knowledge. And it does use a lot of different vocabulary because one reason is because it's a competitive marketplace, right? There's a lot of comics and a lot of graphic novels. How are you going to stand out? Right? One of the ways that you stand out is to have a distinct style, like any writer, right? You want a distinct style, and that means using lots of rich vocabulary. The other thing that graphic novels are good for is helping students think about inferencing when reading, right? So thinking about mood, thinking about characterization. These are the things that we want readers to do. We want our students to do in order to like fully comprehend or to have a good engagement with the text. All right. Make sense that there's some reasons why we might want to do this. All right, so let's look at some of the stuff that you would get from it. All right, so here is a graphic novel called Alan's War. It was the memories of G.I. Alan Cope. So he's a U.S. soldier that fought in World War I. And I think, no, World War II, sorry. And he was stationed in France. And so the book follows him from basic training over to being in France during the war. And what's interesting about it is that unlike most war comics or war stories, there's a lot of downtime, right? Because he's like, they're not fighting 24/7, right? And so he tries to capture what the life of a soldier is when they're not actually in battle. Okay. Without even reading the text here, just looking at the color scheme, what are some things that you would suggest about the tone of this story that he's telling? What kind of mood does the art and the color scheme create for you?
It's gloomy.
Yeah, it's
Gloomy.
gloomy. Yeah. So
Dark,
why is it gloomy?
It's a sad situation.
No, yeah, I understand that, but
Oh.
what about the art or the color scheme makes it feel gloomy?
It's great.
It's gray, right? You got a lot of gray. Other folks, so dark, intense, all gray and black, right? So originally you have these somber, muted tones, right? So when you're reading this novel, when you're reading this graphic novel, of course, you're looking at the images. That gives you information for comprehension. You're looking at what the narrator is saying or what the characters are saying, and that gives you information, right? But the art itself, the color, the tone, the composition, that also gives you information that you need to interpret when you're reading the novel, right? And so here it's leading you towards the tone already, right? It's somber, it's gray, right? He's talking about difficult times during the war. I recommend this novel. I quite like this novel. There's a sequel as well, but this first one is good. You know, particularly if you've got a student that may be interested in war or may be interested in those sorts of memories. And you can see here the one of the knocks on Mouse, right? I'll go back to Mouse for a second. Mouse is pretty busy, right? In terms of the page construction, right? And there's lots and lots of words. You can see here in this part of Mouse, you have the whole page is them on the train, and then these two insert panels of them doing, you know, particular things. So this is a little complicated page, one image and then two images interpolated in the middle of it, right? So that might be confusing for some readers, right? But in Allen's War, it's much more straightforward, right? This 6-panel construction of the page, right? This panel, the next panel, the next panel, the next panel, right? And so the paneling here may facilitate some readers' engagement with the text as compared to like what Spiegelman did in Mouse. Yeah, Irene, or somebody going to say something?
Yes, I noticed that in the novel, the graphic novel Mouse.
Yep.
It is confusing because I think the writer wants us to feel like him or the people.
Yes.
That it was a confusing time. And I'm looking at the other one, the one with the war. It's not that busy or confusing, but it's still, you know, gray, depressing. So we are still,
Right.
we feel what the characters feel, maybe.
Right. Irene, I think that's a really good point, right? And think about the, you know, if you're a Mouse / you know, Jew that's dealing with the Nazi presence, right? You're always under observation, right? You're always being watched, right? And so here, this tight panel with the characters in it, this tight panel with the characters in it, right? So it does create that feeling of claustrophobia, right? Because you're being watched, you're being observed, and you have to move, right? So that all that stuff is great, and Spiegelman doesn't have to write it out in longhand, right? So he's able to communicate that through the page structure and through the perspective, right? Which is why graphic novels, when they're good, are really, really rich texts, right? This is what I don't see in most like Shakespeare adaptations, right? Most Shakespeare adaptations are like, oh, Benvolio, I've got a sword, I'm going to stab you, right? And it's like, it's not particularly interesting visually, right? So, right, so there's a lot going on here in this one, right? So, but you're right. So in Allen's War, like, as I said before, like, this is not a combat scene, right? And so in fact, it's kind of the moment in between combat. And so it's a little bit more spacious, right? It's a little bit more open and not as claustrophobic. Okay, so here's this book was okay, right? How many of you know who Robert Moses was? On a scale of, I guess that's just a yes or no. Or no, it's a yes, no, maybe.
I know, because I'm from New Jersey. I know who he is.
All right. Other folks know who Robert
Yes,
Moses?
I know. We have a Robert Moses State Park is out on Long Island, I believe.
Okay. All right. Other people? All right. So for the people that, yeah, if you grew up in the Bronx, you know, right? So if you don't know who Robert Moses is, tell me what you think. So he was a real person. So this is a story of Robert Moses. So if you didn't know who Robert Moses was, tell me what you think you can learn about him just from the cover of this graphic novel.
He has something to do with bridges.
Okay.
Architect.
Yeah, he's an architect. He deals with bridges. What kind of guy do you think he is?
He's wearing a suit. So
Yes, if you're in a suit, so what does that tell us?
The businessman.
He's a businessman.
Patriotic. There's a flag in the background.
Flag, yeah. What else can you tell me about him, maybe?
Must be a big character physically and in his reputation.
Right, because he's looming over the city, right?
He's about the size of a building.
Yeah. So, so good guy or bad guy? would the cover suggest?
He's a good guy. He has the flag behind him.
Okay, that's one interpretation. Other interpretation, bad guy. Irene, why is he a bad guy?
No,
He-
I said good guy. Oh, I'm
No,
sorry.
it's another Irene.
Oh, that's another one, sorry. So Irene, the other Irene, why is he a bad guy? Based on-
He split up communities. He broke the Bronx in half.
Yeah, in real, yes, he's definitely a bad guy in real life, right? So,
Mhm.
but how does the cover let us know?
Yeah, he's.
Oh, because it's dark.
He's very
He's dark, he's in the shadows.
Mhm.
larger
fact-
than life.
In fact, what do we know about how Moses went about his work? Was he ever elected to one single important office?
No, he was
No.
always like in the
Shady-
background.
Shady like in the photo.
Yeah, he was like shady like in the photo.
figure, shady
He's on-
figure, just like in the photo.
Right, he was on this commission and that commission and that commission and that commission, and I was kind of like working behind the scenes to like destroy the Bronx and other places, and he was gonna put a highway right down Manhattan. So he destroyed some neighborhoods and some communities, right? So even if you don't know Moses, Robert Moses, when you see this cover, you already get a sense of what the author's perspective is, right? That Moses is going to be bad news and how he operated, right? So this is the type of inferencing that you can talk about and do with graphic novels, right? So it's not practicing inferencing, it's not getting ready to do other inferencing, it's actually inferencing, right? You're reading and you're making inferences. All right, so here's another, I like baseball, so sorry. So here's another graphic novel, and this is about Roberto Clemente, and I don't know if people remember or knew who Roberto Clemente was, but even if you don't know anything about him, what might you be able to tell me about him on the basis of this page?
Baseball player.
He's a baseball player. He's a Latino, right? How do you know he's a Latino, Georgina?
Arriba.
Arriba, right?
Because his last name and Roberto.
Yes, his name at this note too, right?
Yeah.
So and what does so here's the kind of captions, right? So instead of being squares, these captions are sort of, irregular and not square. What kind of feeling does that give the page and the panels? Right? Compare it to the dialogue and the description here, right? Which is just like line, straight line.
Yeah,
Right?
there's something orderly about this one, but
Right.
this one, it's not your typical, it's not typical. It's not
Right.
like the original. I mean, how everybody does it. He's
Right.
different.
Right. And both Brandy and Georgina, I think, pointed out, like, it gives the feeling of movement, right? It's not static. The word balloons themselves give the feeling of movement. And Clemente's a baseball player. So what do you want to do? You want to suggest that activity. You want to suggest that movement, right? And so here, the author is able to use the captions, even the structure of the box, to communicate some things, right? And then you can also see the color scheme is the old Pittsburgh Pirates kind of color scheme, right? So that also gives us that feel, right? So much information here, this style, right? So as Georgina said, Clemente had a certain style, a certain flair, right? And so the page and the text gives you a sense of that Clemente style. All right, so here's another page. So this is Joe Sacco. Joe Sacco calls himself a graphic journalist. And what he does is he goes around the world like any journalist, and he embeds himself in communities. So he's got a book about Palestine. He lived in the West Bank for 4 or 5 months and reported on what it's like to live in the West Bank. He has a book about the former Yugoslavia, being there when the Civil War was happening. He's got a recent book about going into Canada and hanging out in some of the First Nations territories for people that are fighting for environmental justice up there. So Sacco is a journalist, but his method is to draw graphic journalism. So he goes and draws a picture. So here's the first page of him reporting on Chechnya, right? I don't know how much you know about the war in Chechnya. with the Chechens and the Russians. But tell me about this woman's emotions. She says, I'm not going back to that place. No one's going to send me back to Chechnya. So how would you describe what she's feeling?
Despair.
Okay, yeah, despair. She's feeling pain. Okay. Are there some things that she's feeling that you recognize that you can't actually put into words? Right? So, you know, when you go to a museum and you see a painting, right, or you see a statue, can you articulate everything that you feel, or is sometimes the meaning that is created in you kind of beyond words or outside of words? That's the case for me, right? There's times when like even putting it into words would sort of diminish what I'm feeling, right? So I think all these things are true, her anguish, you know, her pain and suffering, but I think there's also maybe at some level, there's things about her feeling that you can't even describe, but you recognize or you sympathize with. What's the response of her townmates, of the other people in town?
They're just watching her. I don't think they feel the same way, or maybe they do, but they're not expressing it.
Right.
They seem
So-
indifferent. Yes, they seem. She almost seems like she's praying also.
Yeah. Yeah. So so are they connected to her? Or are they sort of disconnected from her?
Indifferent, disconnected.
Yeah. And how do we know that visually?
Because the woman continues to walk, you know, she just glances back, but she continues walking.
Yeah.
And
Doesn't,
the others are standing away from her,
Yeah,
far away.
far away. So they're in the background of the image, right? Which creates this feeling of distance, right? So she's in the forefront and these other people are in the back, right? So they're non-responsive. They're like, all right, whatever, right? So here Sacco is able to both, you know, try to capture the feeling of anguish of this woman, and then also what the townspeople are doing kind of in the back. All right. There's a famous manga from Japan called Barefoot Gen. And it's about dropping the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. This puts the graphic in graphic novel. So here's this page. You can see the bomb has just dropped and it's about to affect people. All right. So I did not put the other pages up because they're very explicit, very graphic about what happens to the human body, what happened to the human bodies in Hiroshima. Right. So, but for some people, seeing it drawn, that visceral experience makes it clearer and hits more home for them than reading about it. All right. So, and in some ways it makes it both digestible in the sense that you can process it, but also real in some sort of way, right? So it's a really moving story, but it's very, very graphic, like what happens to the people in the story. All right, so here's another affordance. So I'm talking about all these as affordances of graphic novels. It's like what graphic novels can do that regular novels can't do, right? With the image, with the connection of the text to the image. All right, so this character's name is Jimmy. So tell me about Jimmy's mental state. What does this page tell us about Jimmy's mental state? Yes, he's depressed. He's alone. Yes, he's home alone. All right. So how do you know that he's depressed?
posture.
His posture, his face, his eyes. All right. And then what is this big panel here?
The lamp.
No,
No, maybe,
not the
maybe
lamp.
maybe the
Blank.
lamp.
Blank.
It's not blank.
It's wallpaper.
It's his wallpaper.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So he's literally staring at the wallpaper, right? So you go from his perspective, Jimmy's like, huh, huh. He's staring at the wallpaper, right? So if I had written that out, even if I'm a good writer, what could I have said? So Jimmy feeling utterly depressed and alone in the world, his thoughts wander and he starts to obsess and he starts staring blankly at the wallpaper. Now, granted, that's not a very good piece of writing, but even if it was a good piece of writing, I don't think it could communicate what this does, right? Which is like, here's the damn wallpaper that he's just staring at, and you're him now just staring at this wallpaper, right? And so you're able to interpret this. Yeah, and as Renee pointed out, he has no mouth, right? He can't even speak. He literally can't speak because he has no mouth, right? So this is something else that a graphic novel can do. All right. This is from a great graphic novel called American Born Chinese. I think it skews a little bit younger, not middle school, maybe high school or so. It's 3 stories it's 3 interweaving stories about a Chinese American immigrant and a monkey king and this sort of like other fantastical story. So this is one of the stories. It's about the sort of Chinese immigrant adolescent, right? I think this is a really powerful page. So I'll give you a little bit of the background. He likes this girl. He likes the blonde girl. She's a classmate of his. He likes her. She doesn't seem to like him. She maybe seems to like this other guy. And so what is Jin's sort of thought process on this page?
Well, he sees that, I think he not, the guy looks different from him, and what's
Yep.
different is the hair.
Yeah. And
And he's
so, no, keep going.
Oh, he's thinking that that's the type of boy she likes.
Yes.
Blonde
So-
hair, blonde
Right.
curly hair.
Right.
Totally opposite of what he has.
Right. So he has reduced it, right? He's reduced his situation to this blonde curly hair, and actually he gets a perm.
Yeah.
In the story, he gets a perm, and people are like, what? Why did you get a perm, right? So, but again, I think this page, without words, does it more powerfully than you could have done it with words, right? Here's just the visual image of the hair, and then he ends up with that same hair. Yeah, Brandy, you were gonna say something?
Does he color his hair as well?
No, no, he doesn't color his hair, but he gets the perm, and everybody's like, why did you get a perm? And he's really embarrassed. So
I thought he was gonna get a wig.
yeah. So this is, I think, a perfect way of like the visuals kind of reduce it to a key element, right? So if you're talking to a student about what's the most important part of this paragraph, right? Or what's the main idea of this paragraph? What's the most important word, right? These are conversations that we can have with students. They pick out a word, they explain why they think that word is the most important thing, right? And here you could be like, oh, Jin thinks the hair is the most important thing, right? And you can walk through it this way. All right, the next page is another panel from page from American Born Chinese, which I think is a great piece of construction. I'll take you a second to read it and then see if you can point out what you think you might see going on here in terms of the text construction.
Well, they're just making racial slurs.
Right, so they're making racial slurs, right? So think about the structure of the page, however.
Oh,
So here we have the 3 friends talking, right? Like you guys suck, ha ha ha. So they're having fun and laughing, right? The mirror of that panel is them being laughed at, right? So we go from this panel, they're having fun and relaxing and laughing, and now down here, the laughing is directed at them, right? So it's this echo, this negative echo of the laughter. And then here in this upper right-hand panel, you got these racist kids making these horrible statements. And then in the parallel panel, they're mortified, right? They're like hurt, speechless, right? So the top panels set up these bottom panels, right, to resonate in certain ways, right? So here it's fun. Here it's not fun. Here they're being, assaulted with racist language. And here they're silent, and because of the racist language, right? So I think it's really, really well thought out in terms of how he set this page up, right? So in addition to just thematically, yeah, these racists are ruining their day, he reinforces that with the text structure. Okay. Oh, here's another baseball reference. So there's this book, James Sturm's America, God, Gold, and Golems. It's a lot of like stories about early 20th century America. And this is about the Stars of David. I don't know if any of you know about the Stars of David, but they were a traveling baseball team that was all Jewish Americans. And so they all had like, traditional beards. And this is a story kind of folding the story of the traditional Jewish story of Gollum into it by getting another like big bat there, right? So this is the first page. What does this first page remind you of? What does it look like?
Newspaper.
Yeah, and particularly what part of the newspaper?
Oh,
Like
that's-
front page?
I don't think it's the front page. Is it news or is it
The
something else?
sports, the sports
Advertising.
section.
I don't think it's the sports section.
Advertisements.
It's an advertisement, right? It's an old-fashioned advertisement. It's an old-fashioned flyer, right? And so by looking at this, you can talk about, oh, this artist is bringing you back into the time period by showing you an old-fashioned ad, right? And so you have to recognize that this is what this genre is. It's an old-fashioned ad. Okay. So quickly, I want to talk about a couple other things. Scott McCloud writes about comics, and one of the things he talks about is the gutter and closure. So the gutter is this space between these two panels, right? And closure is what the reader does to connect one panel to the next. So here in this first panel, this guy goes, "Now you die." And the other person's like, "No, no." And then you see, yeah, right? So what happened? What happened between those two panels?
I think he died.
I think he died, right? Like he got hit with he got hit with the axe, right? So, but you as the reader, you have to make that connection, right? So from the one panel to the next, you have to bring closure, right, to these two panels. The second panel doesn't say, "Oh, and then the poor guy died," right? So you have to make that connection. And what McCloud suggests is that there's lots of different ways to think about the gutter, right? So for example, here's this panel. Do you think the Sox could finally do it this year? So this is before 2004 when the Red Sox won. Do you think the Sox could finally do it this year? I guess. So what does this repetition of this image suggest?
He's not interested.
He's not interested. And tell me about time.
He stays like that a long time.
Right.
That's
So time is passing, right?
Yes.
So the same image, the time is passing. All right, here. Hey, I deserve a better job. I could be a brain surgeon, I guess. So how is time passing noted here?
It took longer to respond on the first strip.
Okay, right. And in the second strip, what's different about the second strip that might suggest time passing as well?
He answered faster because there are less repetition of him not saying anything.
Maybe. Look at the size of the gutter in the first panel, in the first strip, and look at the size of the gutter in the second strip. Right?
Mhm.
This gutter is wider.
So time is still passing?
Time is still passing, right? So here's this information that's provided by the lack of something, right? So this is how complex these texts can be, right? They're not simply like Peanuts, haha, Snoopy, right? So you can represent time passing this way. And the third one is yet another way of representing time passing.
True.
Right? That
Yeah.
third panel is longer. than the other two panels, which suggests that that third panel took longer than the other two panels, right? So these are all things that when you're readers of comics, you start to learn the visual language, right?
Mhm.
So McLeod also suggests that there's other ways of thinking about panel to panel, like movement to movement, action to action, like subject to subject, scene to scene, like aspect to aspect, like here's Christmas, you get it by getting like the little different parts, and then just non sequitur, like random stuff, right? So as readers, we learn to go from one panel to the next, and there's different types of transitions. And then if you become a real expert in this, you can start playing with the form and go meta. So I love this one on the right, if you take a look and see. So what's happening in this one?
He comes out of the book.
He comes out of the book. He's like, I'm tired of being in the book, so I'm going to escape the book, right? So
Yeah.
he literally breaks out of the panels. Right? And then on the left, you think it's going to be the sun, and it turns out to be a guy with a really bad suntan, right? So once you understand what the rules are, you can start playing around with the rules, right? Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about, because I know we're getting close to the top of the hour, is using graphic novels as potentially as text sets, right? So in addition to them being good for things like inferencing and vocabulary development and visualizing, teaching them together, like any text set, gives you opportunities to really get in-depth conversations, right? So here's a proposed text set. So have people heard of March? So March is a graphic novel. This is the first part of a trilogy by John Lewis, right? Civil rights movement icon, about the March on Selma. So March is about the nonviolent aspects of the civil rights movement, right? The Martin Luther King Jr. and the nonviolence as a strategy, right? Over on the left is a graphic novel about Nat Turner. For those of you who don't know about Nat Turner, decidedly not nonviolent, right? Nat Turner was like, they've enslaved me, they've punished me, they've killed my family, I'm going to kill them. That's the way that I'm going to escape, right? So on the one hand, you've got people saying that we overcome, they can overcome systemic racism through nonviolent means. You got Nat Turner saying you overcome systemic racism by the use of violence. And then you got Frederick Douglass. And for those of you that know about Frederick Douglass, he was like a little bit this way, a little bit that way. Like, my mind's not made up, right? Zora Neale Hurston, who's a famous writer, Their Eyes Were Watching God and other things. She was also a little bit like, yeah, I get nonviolence, but I also understand violence, right? So if you read these books as a set, then you can have a discussion about, your students and your own thoughts about violence as a political strategy, right? When it's appropriate, when do you think it's not appropriate, right? At that point, you're getting into the real stuff, right? The real reason that we read things, the real reason that we discuss things, right, is about how we have an impact on our world and how it affects us in the world, right? So this is just one example text set. Another example text set could be these. So The Photographer is a great book. It combines photographs and drawings of somebody with Doctors Without Borders being in Afghanistan when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The second book, The Best That We Can Do, is about a Vietnamese immigrant to the United States dealing with the Vietnam War and then fleeing the Vietnam War. And then the third one is a collection of anti-war comic books. Bless you, Lucy, right? So read together, right, what you could have discussions about war and how it affects people, right? What's the impact on people? What's the trauma that war produces on people, right? And because graphic novels are sometimes quicker to read, not because they're easy, right? But there's less content, they can be shorter. Sometimes it's easier to make graphic novel text sets, right? Rather than like a traditional novel text set, because it takes a long time to read a traditional novel, right? So in addition to working on individual skills, you bring them together and you have these really deep discussions about themes. All right. So that's a not so quick tour about graphic novels, but with the 3 minutes that we have left, like thoughts that you have about either graphic novels that you would recommend or ways that you think that you might use graphic novels in your own class.